Small crowd.
Joe scare everybody away by mentioning he wants to talk about the application mix-ins.
I would love to talk about deprecation mix-ins for an hour. That sounds wonderful.
Very productive, yes.
I'm actually kind of glad we got what's today? It's the 6th. Okay, so yeah, so we don't have those people signed in aren't here. I am glad we'll have time to dig into it.
Well, can you all hear me?
Loud and clear.
Oh, well, I'm trying the one AirPod thing. I didn't know if that would actually work. It's cool.
Works. I couldn't tell it was from an AirPod, and usually it's not. Those aren't the best with the microphone.
Yeah. Oh, I know. I was really hesitant to get them, but the convenience.
Is it Pro or?
Yeah, the Pro. Yeah.
Yeah. They keep falling out of my ears. That's the problem. And don't.
That was my biggest. Yeah, I don't want to exercise with these either.
Yeah, I tried. It doesn't work. They fly everywhere. It's a disaster. You can get foam tips though. Complay or whatever, they made foam tips for the previous ones, like memory foam tips, and they just came out with ones for pros, and they're not great, but they're better than the thing that they came with, at least.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'll look for that.
Anyways, sorry.
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about app mix-ins. I actually feel pretty good. I feel like we are getting really, really close here. There's a couple of questions that I put on I think like Javier mentioned, I put them in spec channel. I'll post it here. But I tried to catalog basically what I think is left to get answered. And I'd love your opinions on those.
Dan was the lead for the Buildpacks team for a while. So he should also probably have some good opinions here for what the stuff should look like. It's a good group. Okay, so the stuff at the very end, list outstanding things. So the key names to use, that's just like idempotent, that stuff.
Yeah, that's very cosmetic, right? I actually am very happy with the structure of the schema. Some of the name, like having a Boolean and a list as the two constructs that define how mix-ins are provided in their own table. It also leaves the door open for something we talked about that I can't remember what is. You could add another key there for having its own table. I just more generally allows us to do things with it later on, but I can't remember what the specific example was. Any as a key is kind of weird, but
yeah, I agree.
I like that it's a Boolean.
I agree also on that too. This is okay. So I did have I don't know if this is some thoughts about the structure. So the structure doesn't bother me, but the top level key is mix-ins, where mix-ins is a list of objects, but in every other context in the spec, mix-ins is a list of strings. Is there a way we could structure that so that the mix-ins, the top level thing isn't, like you could do any dash mix-ins equals true and mix-ins equals list and make it at the top level, but that's kind of gross, right? Could we buildpack.stackpack any, like, well, but I don't know.
No, I definitely, well, I mean, buildpack.stack I would do.
Yeah. Buildpack.stack, any dash mix-ins equals true, mix-ins equal list is alternatives.
So is this Buildpack toml supposed to be like a superset of the existing buildpack.toml, meaning that we should be able to use the same parser for both? Because it doesn't look like it right now, right?
No, this is the same schema. There is one schema for buildpack toml, and depending on how you use it, or depending on what kind of buildpack you're using, you would use it in different ways. So the minute so like for example, we would say that if privilege is not set to true, then you cannot do the mixins thing. Or maybe not though. Unless I don't know if we can provide mixins now from a regular build pack. That doesn't seem like something we'd want to do. But no, I like the intention is like this is the build pack TOML schema.
Okay, cool.
So I guess the implication is it needs to be compatible with everything that's in there, and also not confusing. Where it's like, kind of, I think what was it? Kind of like in the inline build pack where we were talking about the various like permutations of having these different keys. Like we need to keep that in mind too.
On the buildpack.mixins list, could this, if the build pack supports multiple stacks, having a fixed list of mixins, the top level doesn't make sense because
that's
the mixins,
a good point.
Yeah, so I think it should go under each stack. And for a stack pack, the meaning of the mixins that you're requesting becomes the meaning of the mixins you're providing, which is very weird, but I think it kind of makes sense.
Hold on, I want to pull up the existing schema.
I'm looking at an example at Buildpack.
So you have mixins equals and then a list. Those are the required mixins, right?
Sorry, are you sharing? Or, no.
Yeah. Let me share. Come on.
Could we do the same thing and utilize the same list of mixins, and instead of it being an object, if we just need this any functionality, do the asterisk that we're thinking about doing for any stack?
Isn't any key though?
I didn't hear that, Terrence.
Is any a key?
So any for the any stack, last conversation we had was the ID you could put an asterisk, and then that resolves to being compatible to any stack. And in this case, I guess what I'm saying for mixins, instead of making mixins an object where we're really only adding one key that resembles any, could we also provide an additional like exclusive mixin, which is an asterisk to represent any compatibility?
What would it look like? So would it be like a one item list, and the one item in the list is star, and you can't put other things in the list?
Pretty much. I mean, we could talk about and determine whether it makes sense to add additional items to it.
I guess you could do static validation on the other items, because we do have the idea of statically. Yeah, that's actually, I kind of like that, because we did say that, when the Boolean's off, you could do static validation, right? But you could mix, if you do the same asterisk thing we do for the stack, you could combine the asterisks and mixins to say statically validate these mixins, or like this will always provide, that's providing them, right?
Yeah.
This will always provide these mixins, but it could also provide any other mixin, which is kind of meaningless because you can't really do any validation when it's going to provide anything. But I don't hate it, or like I'd still be okay with it, even though it's not.
Yeah, and I think what we're talking about whether or not you could add additional elements, right? But the overall of whether or not we could have an asterisk.
I don't love the asterisks.
Is it because it's hard to pronounce?
Well, I guess I don't like it because it is a hard and fast requirement on the mixin names, where previously it was just a string, right?
Or if it's not a requirement in mixin names, it's literally just like asterisk is a special string that means,
right?
This thing. I mean, I guess you're saying it restricts the character set for mixins further, but I don't know if we want to.
It's not horrible.
Yeah, it's like a reserved keyword, right? Which we've done for other things.
I have no opinion actually about whether we do that or we do a Boolean inside of that stacks key that's like any dash mixins or provides any mixins equals true. I don't think I have a strong opinion at all.
What I don't like about the additional key is that it was, right? It seems like you're making some tweaks here, but it was changing the idea of it being an array of strings to being an array of objects. which is a very different solution.
But that additional key would go in the stacks list. It wouldn't go inside of that mixins list here. So I think they're orthogonal things.
Were we not thinking about moving them into the stacks list? Maybe I'm confused.
So that the any equals true key
What is the new proposed structure right now?
You see, he's sharing it
Yeah. Where would we put the any string right now? Or
right
the
there.
Word. Do you mind adding it, Joe, just for sample?
Like this?
Yeah.
And then
Maybe that or one field with one special single item array with one special string in it that has asterisks.
yeah, I definitely don't have, like, I prefer not the asterisks, but I don't care.
Same boat, but I don't even know if I have a preference one way or the other at this point.
I mean, I have similar concerns about this as I do about the asterisks, so I don't know.
Yeah, to me, this just seems like it just doesn't seem appealing or easy to understand. I feel like we're going to end up with like an Engine X configuration where it's a whole bunch of special.
Instead of
don't use that.
Instead of deciding right now, can we just document the two options and then
Yeah, I think so.
move on to the harder stuff? Because like at some point, if we can't decide on this, we just pass the RFC through and say, we promise we'll implement one of these two things. I don't think it's worth holding on.
Right, that makes sense. The one thing that I think needs to be pinned down is that it belongs under stacks. I think we all agree on that, right?
Has to.
Yep.
I'm gonna save this gist. I should probably do it.
You should save the gist.
Yes.
All right. Let me pull up the RFC.
I think if you wanted to just keep adding stuff to the gist as we talk, just to make sure we get it really down, but like really help to see it here and realize that, wait, we got a problem.
Are you this part of it and then the non-idempotent?
You cut out for a little bit. Did you ask, are we okay with privileged and then the non and also non-idempotent?
Yeah.
Privileged, I'm absolutely not going to block on it, but it doesn't immediately indicate stack pack, but you're trying to fit it into the root build pack framework, which makes a lot of sense, but root build packs don't exist yet. And that makes me feel a little weird about it. Sorry.
I only have like 20% confidence that root build packs will ever be a thing, like generically. So yeah, I'm not sure how much I want to plan ahead for that.
Once we separated out the thing where we don't break ABI and the thing where we do break ABI, a lot of people that clicked for a lot, like McNew is very happy about that division.
Oh yeah.
Build packs break rebasing. He was like, he was really concerned about stack packs, like being this thing where, like, he was like, if we did stack packs and we don't have contracts there, then we should just disable rebasing. It's not worth it, right? And when we did the split, he was like, okay, now we get the value and we get the place where you do break the rebasing. And so I wouldn't say there'd be much resistance to root build packs. So like, that's not the reason I worry about it. I just worry about it because it's not like this is going to go in first. Like it feels weird to, like, we're designing for something that's a little too far out.
No, I understand. I'm totally open to something else. So what we could do, actually, no, this won't work for if you don't provide mixins. We could use these as like triggers. Identifying something is, but then that doesn't work with the CA certs example where it's not actually a mixin.
Yeah.
And I think privilege still has a meaning, right? These stack packs are being run as root. Is that right? At least that would be my understanding from this key. So if that is true, then I think it still makes sense. I think it grew on me over time.
But then I would want to call it a privileged build pack instead of when people see
Done. Got it.
All right. Okay, then we're done. Easy. If you're happy with privileged build pack, and privileged build pack just means a very specific kind of thing, then yeah. Like do it.
Yeah, that's probably actually more appropriate. Like root is kind of one part of what it means, right? Like there's the whole snapshotting and the fact that it doesn't, there's different implications. So
Privileged is very meaningful and concise to, well, I think it's very meaningful in how we're using this in the K8s ecosystem, because privileged usually means like it can do things at the root level, right? It kind of means like your container has host privileges sometimes, which isn't exactly true here, which that may be a little bit confusing, but I don't think it will be. So either way.
Yeah, I know what you mean, but I think the fact that it's in the build pack and not in like the app or something like that is helps.
Cool. And then there's privilege, and you had another question about a flag that's not there, I thought.
No, I think that was it.
Idempotent.
Non-idempotent. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I actually feel pretty strongly that we should just stick with that. There is some prior art in I think it was the HTTP spec, and it's not going to What's that?
Just said it's very clear.
Yeah, right. So it's not any clunkier than like clear-env or provides mixins, so I think it's fine.
Agree.
Just taking some notes. The next one was about the ignored DIRs. And
oh yeah, this is a fun thing. Yes, we should.
These are the ones. I think we should just stick with what Canico does, plus layers and temp.
Yeah, we should. And CMV. We should assume that temp can be cleared, and therefore you shouldn't put stuff in it. Agree. You could. I mean, that opens the door to like, well, what about var temp, and what about and so there's maybe some weirdness there. We could add var temp too.
Sure. I'm fine with that. Does it need to be configurable?
Is that something that we could punt on?
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking too.
I would make it, not configurable for now. Sorry.
Yeah, that's what I would say. It just seems if we need to make it configurable, it's an extension we can add later.
There's I think the wording for not allowed, I think it's actually two sets of things. There's a set of things where you're not allowed to write to, three sets of things. There's a set of things where you're not allowed to write to these because it would break things. There's a set of things that you're not allowed to write to because they're thrown away. And there's a set of things that you're not allowed to write to and it wouldn't break anything, but you shouldn't do it anyways, if that makes sense. Like layers, right?
Yeah,
like
that's sort of my fifth bullet. Yeah.
Cool. Layers versus
let's go ahead and,
versus temp.
Yeah, let's talk about that then. The interesting thing about the layers directory is like you could let a build pack write to it and it's like fine.
So the layers directory has a set of subdirectories in it that are the build pack IDs, and these build packs won't get past that. And so because like they'd have to like specifically for to do anything bad in layers, they'd have to go into another build pack ID directory and start mucking around, right? I think it's just enough to say like, we're not going to pass you a layers directory in an argument. So, and you're not supposed to write to layers, so don't do it.
That's where you put launch toml though. That's the only thing. So we should probably find a better place for launch toml. I guess you could have multiple stack packs. Is that the problem? Should launch toml be ephemeral here? So you want to create a layers directory for the stack pack to hold its specific configuration. That's not a bad idea. Yeah, it also is nice because you don't have just like this thing that's provided in the other, like for a regular build pack, but is not provided for a stack build pack. So even like I've been using regular build packs for my tests, and like they write the layers. It's like whatever, I just throw it away. It's kind of interesting.
Ties into
I
whether
don't
we use the
know
builder code too.
what's that.
Ties into whether we use the builder code also. Could a stack pack ever want to provide build time environment variables and like runtime environment variables?
Yeah, that
Build
was one of my
packs?
other questions too, or even or receive them also.
Yeah, I just walked GitLab through using Crane to modify their images after they write them yesterday to add an environment variable for a port. And this could kind of work towards solving some of those use cases that are like, you need to make a change. You don't control very much, but you need to make a change across everything.
Yeah, because we could allow the layers env and for build time and just discard it, right? Or even, I guess, for launch. I don't know.
The root ownership is where this gets interesting, though.
Yeah. I mean, the lifecycle could just like change mod the layers directory at the end.
Yeah, but I don't like changing the ownership of. It's like I like how it runs as the normal user and then stays as being owned by that user, as opposed to like something changing about the structure of the files you created later. Here's like a terrible idea maybe. What if it created a new, slash stacks or something like that at the root, right? And then stack pack ID, and then launch toml inside of that. And then if later we want to add features, even layers into that, we can, but they become kind of separate things. You could imagine like a
so
stack
that would be the argument in place of the layers directory, would be that stack layer thing or something.
Slash and something that's not layers. And
right.
You could do things like, maybe it's okay to write SUID binaries in there as root, that when you execute as root, like that could be a place where you could do some weird stuff. But again, like it's also, I don't know.
Yeah, it seems like it could be potentially valuable to have like a scratch pad area that's not temp.
You have the whole file system though,
Yeah, but then that'll all be snapshotted, and well, I guess you could clean it up at the end or something.
What does it mean to access this layers directory in the build image versus a run image too? Because we're actually talking about two builds. That can get kind of weird.
Yeah, that's a separate question. We can talk about that now if you want.
So that's a motivating factor for keeping it separate also, is that because they're separate in the build image and the run image, the concept of like a layer toml with a run equals,
doesn't make sense.
Yeah. They're that by nature.
I agree. Yeah, it's sort of like you don't need that because the builds themselves are separated. I think like there's a few different things to consider. We talked about this in Slack a little bit, and I think we might actually need multiple mechanisms. One is that they'll get a different set of mix-ins, potentially, for each run, build and run. But we might also want something, especially for like the CA certs example, where they don't get mix-ins, but they still might have different behaviors for build and run, essentially setting up different certs. And in that case, we might have like introduce like a CMV stack type environment variable that they could switch on. That the thing that concerns me with that is I'd hate for stack packs to just be full of like a bunch of if statements. If build do this, if run do that, if build do this, if run do that. And that's why when it comes to like things like launch toml, I like the idea of allowing it to be written and then just ignore it if it's in the build phase, like allow the build, like I kind of want to lean towards allowing the stack build pack to do something in either the build or run environment that's just sort of a no-op or ignored later on, rather than forcing it to have to switch if this, do that.
that feels like it's creating hidden work. It's like on the build image, you might be doing something that you're also doing on the run image that takes cycles or resources or whatever. You're never going to figure that out exactly because it's all set up so that the hidden work never, like.
Yeah, but that's an optimization, right? Like potentially, like, and it's not that I'm saying the capability, like the mechanism to switch on that won't be there. It's just that you sort of start by not thinking about that. And then when you realize, hey, why am I doing this development time thing in my run build, what I'd like propose we'll call extend. And then you realize there's this environment variable and you're like, oh, if it's the run image, don't do that part.
Probably not going to like this idea, but we could introduce a different script, different
No, I don't
binary.
like that idea.
Bin build, bin run. Build happens for build time, bin run happens at runtime.
I wouldn't call it run. I would call it extend. But yeah.
Interesting.
I don't like that because I feel like the 80 or 90% case is that they're identical, or that the different behavior is triggered by the different mix-ins that are being asked for.
I don't see these as things that would often be identical because at build time, you're probably going to want to install packages that are like have dev headers and things for compilation, right? Like you have a Ruby app and you want to use ImageMagick and you don't have ImageMagick on the stack. You want to put ImageMagick dev in one, but you want to put libmagick something on the other.
But isn't that just build : run : on the mixin? Like, or are you thinking specifically a thing that is doing that and not using mixins?
I guess the apt build pack in that case still does the same thing in both contexts. That's your point. Yeah. I'm okay with pass it a flag. I think that just says whether it's build or run, right? It's also, we can go back on that later if we need to.
Wait, past the like bin build a
Past
flag?
CNB stage or CNB, whatever you called it, CNB phase, I forgot, as an environment variable so it can know which thing it's running on.
Oh yeah. Oh, so the phase, like, so I anticipate that the phase will have its own binary, which will probably just be a symlink to a special case of the builder binary.
Sorry. By phase, I just meant running on the build image or running on the run image. I shouldn't have said phase there.
Okay.
But that makes sense. Okay. I think a lot of this has to do with the decision around launch toml. That's why it's like hard to make a decision about the build and run behavior without thinking about what launch toml looks like, because you're talking about like writing that. And can we talk about the use case? So what goes in launch toml? The process types thing feels a little weird to me, but I'm okay with it. What was the other use for launch toml? There's like a slices like thing.
So for the process types, I could definitely see something that installed like an Nginx package type thing, and that is what you actually want to run as your process type too. So that's why I think launch toml processes make sense. The slices is a little weird. Now keep in mind, I think I misspoke when we were chatting on Slack, but like launch toml does not make sense in the build, right? Like it just doesn't make sense. We're ignoring it at a minimum, right?
Doesn't the excludes make sense though?
No, because I think for we could have a separate discussion about the caching, but I think kind of like we were saying about not changing the ignore directories, I think the behavior in the build phase is very like binary. It either caches or it doesn't, and that's the non-idempotent flag. And when it caches, it just caches everything. And there is no exclusion. And if you have a problem with that, you're not idempotent and you set that flag. In the run phase, you definitely need exclude because you want to be able to not just white out things, you want to actually remove them. You could, like, we could do a whiteout thing, but I don't think that's sufficient.
Okay, so during the build phase, how do I cache the app package index and then get that back on a, yeah, how do I cache the app package index?
You run apt install, and that goes into var / something, right?
But if I'm non-idempotent,
Yeah, you don't get that cache.
you don't get the cache. But on the run image, if you're non-idempotent, you can still set paths equal the app package index and cache equals true, and then you do get it back.
Wait, I didn't follow that. On the run image, you're non-idempotent. So let's just start with that. On the run image, you're non-idempotent. So you get nothing back on the next run. But what you're saying is you want to, see, I think of it the inverse way. On the run image, you would be idempotent excluding these directories.
Yeah, so if in the run image, you're not gonna start from the same image again, right? You can still say, here's the app package cache, recover this, reset the image back to whatever it was last time, right? But recover these directories, right? So you still have the apt index. We understand the run image behavior. That non-idempotent flag is a little bit of a performance optimization because it says that when the image above me changes, when the original run image changes, then that's the only case for which you lose the changes and you have to start over and replay them. But you always get the apt package index cache back in both cases, right? On the build image, if we don't have that ability, if every time your base build image changes, which could be often, you lose all the packages and you lose your apt cache, then every build people do that involves build time mix-ins is going to be, a minute longer every other time.
If they're non-idempotent.
But on the build, the non-idempotent flag doesn't always work. It's only relevant in a very small, in a very particular use case where your base image didn't change. When your base image changes, you're always going to start from scratch again. And that's true for the build image also. And that's what worries me.
Oh.
Because we have to replay from scratch whenever the base image changes. And the base image is going to change a lot. That's why it's important to be able to recover the package index, because that doesn't have to change when the base image changes.
That makes sense. So you need 2 levels of caching.
For build, yeah.
For build.
So, but we have a build toml we've talked about. I was really hopeful that we could not have to do that, but I don't think we can avoid it.
Are we, yeah. So when you're saving that package index, you're saying, I'm confident that this directory or set of files can be reloaded from the cache even when my base image changes.
Yes, exactly.
And this is another bit of config that can go into, yeah, like you said, it could be build toml in the whatever is passed as the layers directory. We should probably just call that something more generic, but
yeah, like this starts to get into the layers discussion, right? Which is like, is this thing really launch toml? Like, do we want to, in this RFC, do we want to introduce process types in it and really tie it into that? Or is this some kind of special other file that has
Yeah,
like
extend
a fixed,
toml.
extend toml in /temp? That's probably a bad place for it, but you kind of get the idea, right?
Yeah, no, I get it.
Is this a directory? Maybe this is a directory that we don't have to define where it is, but it's a directory that we pass to the stack pack, like you pass the layers dir to the build pack, where it writes extend toml, and in the build case, extend toml means this, and in the run case, extend toml means that.
Yeah. Wait, do you think there's a need to make them different? Yeah, I guess the exclude. Yeah, like could you just have a stack toml that has like a list of exclusions that happen at run, right? Like, so your build pack writes this stack toml twice, and it has everything that both phases need to know, whether it's exclusions or hard caching or whatever we call it.
Yeah.
And then it's like, yeah, it writes it twice, but like in each case, it just reads one part of it or interprets it its own way. That would kind of serve the goal that I had of, you don't really think about it running twice. You're just like, here's this file that tells you what to exclude at launch and what to cache at build.
I think that it keeps it very consistent, and that's in line with the, if we like the one, which I'm not convinced completely, but like if we like the one program, right? Switching on one consistent flag with two different values and its behavior being very similar between both cases, right? Having it be the same place with the same schema in both places seems good. I'm testing how long it takes to do apt-get update versus the first time versus the second time, and it's a bit faster. The internet's very fast, so it's hard to tell. Yeah. Okay, cool. What next?
That was everything in my list, I think. There's some interesting, as I'm getting into implementation, going a little bit further, what I've been doing is starting with separate files, like separate root builder.go and separate command for it. And it's become really apparent that there's much more in common than there is different. So I'm in the process of like bringing those back together and finding ways of extracting the parts that are different. So that's why, Stephen, for example, I'm trying to work this into builder.go, like the root level builder.go and lifecycle, because so much of it, like the setup, the looping over the group, just lots of different things, the part that actually executes bin build is all the same. And then the parts that are different are like 2 lines where it reads the launch toml, or 2 lines where it's the nvars is something that I think we potentially want later on, but I'd rather try and slice those out into an interface or something like that than have a second builder.go. But that was also Emily's. She agreed with that because I actually started separate, and she encouraged me to start separate. And then after we looked at the code together, she started to encourage me to bring them together. So that was not just me; that was the maintainer looking at it too.
It's the build run paradigm where we keep not thinking about how this is different in those two cases that makes me worry about combining it together, if that makes sense. It's stuff like there'll be an env directory you write at build time in the build image, and there'll be an env directory you write at runtime in the run image, but then there's env.build at env.launch. And what does it mean to write env.launch in the, right? Like there are things in there that are just designed for a different model. And I'm worried this is like a, it's very easy to share code because things look similar, but where the easier to understand thing
Yeah,
is
that makes
more,
sense.
it's more duplication. But
Yeah, it makes sense. It's hard to talk about abstractly. Like, I'd almost rather like straw man PR, and
yeah,
then
yeah,
I'm
100%.
totally fine reworking stuff. Especially since I think the acceptance tests won't change, right? So
When you send me the
that makes it.
code, I just thought you wanted feedback on code. That was the first thing I thought of. It's not a hard, you should change it
Oh
now
yeah,
or anything like that.
yeah, no, I sent that to you because I wanted to confirm the assumptions I was making around running as privileged and then dropping out
Yeah, yeah,
to
that makes sense.
um,
Did you talk to Emily
yeah,
about the privilege dropping? Because there was some weird,
yeah,
we had to link lib muscle and all this crazy stuff. But
yeah, we had a long conversation about that, and I'm basically just following what she recommended.
awesome, that's great.
Let's see, I had some other notes on the second build. It gets interesting, but that kind of relates to what we were talking about with the caching. Oh yeah, so here's what's interesting. I think we only ever want a single layer to come out of a build pack, stack build pack. So it gets kind of complicated when you're loading the cache because you either create the snapshot and then load the cache so that it appears that the cache changes were part of the new snapshot that you're creating. But then you have to, I think, yeah, that's a little, I forget why, but that's like really awkward. The alternative is you load the cache and then you create the snapshot, make your changes, call take snapshot, and then you have two tarballs and you have to like resolve them. And that is basically additive, except for you have to process the whiteout to actually remove things.
Can you say that again? Can you walk through both cases again? I gotta.
Right. So there's this. So the stack build pack process is this like bracket, right? Like you create the snapshotter and establish a baseline, do a bunch of stuff, and then take snapshot. That's the function you call, right? So on the second build, you have this previous snapshot, and the way Canico is designed is like, yay, more snapshots. Put them all layered, layers, yay. But what we want is to have a single snapshot even after we've loaded a cache. So I can either load the cache inside of this bracket, which means that it just appears like another change made by the stack pack. But that I think there's a problem with that because you restore it and then you wouldn't, because you would restore the cache, but you wouldn't actually like load it until the build phase in this bracket, right?
When you say the cache, you mean the excluded layers.
Let's just talk about build, right?
Build has excluded layers also.
No, you would just remove them in the build pack, right? Like what we were saying was,
you're talking about a rebuild though, right? And on the rebuild,
yes.
in the rebuild, it's the same dynamic, right? You're building, you excluded some layers in the last build, right? Or you excluded some directories in the last build.
No, I think it's the opposite. I think in the last build, you would have marked certain directories as like hard cache. Like excluding at build, I think it's tricky because like you kind of have to know a lot about, like if you're doing an apt install, you have to know like which files, like what if you want to exclude something from user bin or something, and it's just a mixin that you installed and you didn't really know what it was. I think it's better to do the like mark this package index for hard caching and everything else just gets normal cached.
I think I'm confused, but okay. During build, right, you still have that same structure of exclude. What are the flags exactly? It's excludes and then cache equals true. Yeah, excludes and then paths and then cache equals true inside of the paths, right? I lost the last person, I think. Okay, right, and so when cache equals true, the things listed in paths are stored off in a different layer, I guess.
So
No.
I was proposing this as
Yeah.
run only, remember? I'm not sure I would propose this same thing for build time.
Oh, what we just talked about though was that we need the same mechanism for build time in order, because the base image is going to change. We need to be able to say, bring back just these things.
Right, but I wouldn't call that excludes, I guess. I would call it something else.
Okay, same structure though, right?
Okay, got it. I'm with you.
Same concept, right?
Okay.
So in both cases, it's the same sort of problem, right? And then
yes, agreed.
in the canonical workflow, I'm going to say it back to you so that I get it. The canonical workflow, you take a baseline, right? This is what the file system looks like now. It understands that. You make some changes, run snap it, right? And it says, okay, these are the changes between the two things, and makes a layer out of that, right? Now you have some excluded stuff there too. You don't want that to end up in that layer. So I'm guessing before you take the baseline, because you want it to exclude things in that were in the base image originally. This isn't about changes, it's about whole directories. That before you take the base, in the process of taking the baseline or something, you want to white out, you want to move the files somewhere else. Take the baseline, right, or something, and then move them back, doing a thing, and then after the build runs, move them back out somewhere else, and then take the cut, and then you have the layer without the excluded things, and then you have the thing with it. And then a next build, recover the snapshot, take the baseline, bring them back, right? But it could change, I guess. It could change between them. So you have to think a little bit about the thing. But I would like move all the files out and back in again a bunch of times or something. Or, if there's a way to tell
yeah,
totally ignore this directory when you're snapshotting.
I was thinking more along the lines of just like post-processing the snapshot, the tarball that it gives back to you.
Isn't that going to
like
be
going and
expensive?
It's really not that bad, right? Because it's just a bunch of paths in the tarball. It might be I guess the downside is it's kind of like clunky in that you have to like explode the tarball, recreate the tarball.
Is it compressed? Is it 2GZ or is it?
Yes, I'm pretty sure it's TGZ.
Yeah, it's a lot of compression and decompression of unnecessary bits you go through there, right?
Yeah, I mean you only have to do it once. Like it's explode it, process the exclusions or whatever, and then recreate it. But the other thing we could do maybe is upstream something into Canico so that it accepts this. They've been pretty, I had to make a couple changes to have it just work as a library, where I can manually configure and ignore directories and stuff like that. They seemed fine with that. Like as a consumer, like me consuming it as a library seemed to be like a case they believe is a first-class case. So
that's really good to hear. That's like, I was worried about that. They're okay with us using it like this.
Yeah, I made it really clear in the PR. I'm using this as a library. That's why I need this change. And it was like no discussion, just good, thanks.
Nice. I worry about the strategy of having it create a TGZ first, both for disk IO and the compression, and then you're going to want to do things like try to read the tar headers. You're going to have to do a lot of decompressing the whole thing afterwards. And if it's big layers you're talking about, I would try to do the manipulation ahead of time, have it take the snapshot of what it needs to do, and then recover it afterwards.
Yeah, having been in the business of creating tarballs as a service, I definitely concur.
I don't know if it answers your real question, which is some more complicated thing about the snapshotting mechanism, but I don't know. I got to drop actually.
Okay. This has been helpful. I can definitely move forward with this information. I think we resolved a bunch of things. So
awesome. Sorry, other people who had to listen to us talk about.
No, it was good. I just turned off the video so you didn't see me, doing other stuff.
Okay, good. As long as you find it useful.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Yeah.